The knock wasn't a knock. It was the sound of someone deciding not to make one. A scrape of fabric against the back door. A breath held too long. Theo Brand stopped with his hand inside the proofing basket and listened. The wall clock his grandfather had hung above the second oven ticked through the silence the way it always did at 2 in the morning. Outside, the side street lay wet from the rain that had stopped hours ago. Inside, 2 loaves were 40 minutes from done. He wiped his palms on the dark gray apron and crossed the flowered floor. His boots made no noise. He had learned years ago how to move quietly through this room, around the corner of the big table, past the hooks with the long peels and the rolling pins hung in their order. He reached for the bolt and stopped. People who came to the back door at 2 in the morning were never customers. He opened it anyway. The light from his ovens spilled out onto 3 figures standing very close together on the wet stone. A woman first, short, slim, dark green skin under a long wine-red wrap dress, a cream cardigan pulled up over her shoulders like she'd dressed in a hurry. Her left lip held a small tusk. Her amber eyes met his and stayed there, measuring him the way Theo measured the rise of dough. In her arms slept a child, tiny, round-faced, bright green. 2 yellow ribbons tied around 2 stubby pigtails. The child's hand was curled around a wooden spoon, and the spoon's handle was pressed into the woman's collarbone, where Theo could see the faded white line of an old scar. Behind her, half a step back, a younger one, 5'2" maybe, a streak of teal cutting through her cropped black hair, headphones around her neck, 2 cloth bags hanging from her shoulders. She was trying very hard to look like she wasn't shaking from the cold. She was failing. Theo looked at the sleeping child, then at the woman. "Come in," he said. The woman did not move. She watched him a second longer, then she did. The younger one slipped past her into the warmth, both bags clutched to her chest, and let out a sound that was half breath and half something close to a laugh. The smell of bread hit her in the doorway, and her shoulders dropped a full inch. Theo closed the door behind them, slid the bolt, stood with his back to it for a moment, looking at his own kitchen the way they were probably looking at it. The yellow light, the 2 ovens running, the big table dusted with flour, the hooks, the wall clock, the order he had built around himself every night for 3 years. "The back room," he said. "Through there. There's an armchair. Lay her down." The woman walked where he pointed. He saw the slight hitch in her step that told him she was carrying a weight she had been carrying too long. The younger one followed. He heard the soft creak of the old armchair taking the child's weight, then the rustle of a cardigan being laid over her like a second blanket. Theo turned to his ovens. The 2 loaves needed checking. He gave them another minute. He needed the minute more than they did. When he came back through, the woman was standing by the big table with her hands behind her back. She had not sat down. The younger one was sitting, both elbows on the wood, headphones still around her neck, eyes already half closed. __quote _3__, Theo said. He pulled the heel of the morning's first bread from the cloth-lined basket where it had been resting. Dark crust, soft pale inside. He had eaten half. He brought what was left with a wooden board and a knife and set it down between them. "I haven't sold any of this, so it isn't yours either, technically. But take it." The younger one's hand was already moving. She caught herself halfway, looked at the woman. The woman gave a single, small nod. The younger one tore a piece. She ate it too fast. She tore another. Her eyes shone with the kind of brightness that Theo had only ever seen on faces that had not eaten properly in 2 days. The woman did not eat. She looked at the bread. She looked at Theo. She looked at the brass measuring weight that hung on a leather cord at his throat, then down at the small white scar across his left thumb, then back at his face. 5, she said. It was not really a question. Theo said. She did not believe him. He could see her measuring it for hidden cost, the way another woman might measure flour. She turned the heel over in her hands, slowly, looked at the crumb, pressed the inside with her thumb to test the give. Her fingers knew what they were doing. Theo recognized the motion before he recognized that he recognized it. She had worked dough before, plenty of it. She tore a small piece, smaller than the younger ones. She ate it. She closed her eyes for 1 second, no longer, and Theo turned away to give her that second alone, because his grandfather had taught him every recipe in the book on the shelf behind him. But the old man had also taught him, without ever saying it, that there were moments when a baker should be doing something else with his hands. He went back to the ovens. The 2 loaves were ready. He pulled the peel from its hook and slid them out, one after the other, onto the cooling rack, and the smell of crust and steam filled the room until the younger one made that half-laugh sound again from her stool. Behind him, through the open doorway of the back room, the child slept on, with her wooden spoon still in her fist. Theo set the peel down, reached for his cloth. The wall clock above the second oven ticked on. He did not look at the woman. He did not need to. He could feel her watching the way he worked, and he could feel that she was not watching like a stranger. She was watching like someone who had stood at a table like this every night for years, and had been told 3 days ago that she could not stand at one anymore. He didn't know that yet. He only knew that the silence in his bakery, for the first time in 3 years, was not the same silence it had been at 1:59. Outside, on the wet street, a single lamp flickered and held. The younger one was the first to break. She had her head down on her folded arms within 10 minutes of finishing the bread. The teal streak in her hair caught the yellow light from the oven. Her breath went long and even. The headphones around her neck slid sideways, and Theo, passing the stool with a tray of seeded rolls bound for the cold proof, reached out without thinking and steadied them so they wouldn't fall and wake her. He did not know her name. He realized, halfway to the cold proofer, that he did not know any of their names. He came back to the big table. The woman was still standing. She had not sat down once. "You can sit," he said. "I'd rather stand." "Suit yourself." He scraped flour into the center of the board with the edge of his bench knife, built it into a small hill, cracked the well in the middle the way his grandfather had cracked it, 2-fingered, quick. He poured the water, watched it pool, began to fold the flour in from the edges. "How long can we stay?" she said. He didn't look up. He heard her exhale, not relief, something quieter than that. A held breath she had been holding since the back door opened, finally let out a little at a time. She said, quote. He glanced up at her then. She was standing on the other side of the table with her hands behind her back, the gold chain at her throat catching the light, the key pendant resting flat against her collarbone above the old scar. Her face was very still. He had expected her to argue. He had been ready for her to argue. He had, in the 8 minutes since she had refused to sit, half-rehearsed 3 different versions of why she should not push him on this. She did not push him. underscore, quote underscore, 17 underscore underscore, she said. That was all. She watched him fold the dough another moment, and then she walked very quietly to the stool next to the sleeping younger one, and she sat down. Not because he had told her to, because her legs had decided. Theo turned the dough out, began to knead. The motion came up through his forearms the way it always did, the slow press and fold, the quarter turn, the press and fold again. The white powder rose from the table in soft, small clouds and settled on the rolled cuffs of his shirt. He worked. The wall clock ticked. The younger one breathed, slow and deep, head still on her arms. In the back room, the child did not stir. He stole one glance at the woman. She was watching his hands, not his face, not the room, not the door behind her. His hands, the way they moved on the dough, the angle of the wrist, the weight he was putting through the heel of his palm. He saw her eyes track the motion. He saw, for 1/2 second, her own right hand twitch on the worn wood of the stool as though it had wanted, of its own accord, to mirror what his were doing. She caught herself, folded her hands into her lap. The motion is familiar to her, Theo thought. And he kept kneading, and he did not say anything about it, because he had not been raised to ask people why they knew the things they knew. He pulled the dough into a round, set it in the oiled bowl, covered it with the linen cloth that had a small stain in the corner from where his grandfather had set down a hot kettle in 1980-something and never managed to wash out. He carried the bowl to the proofing shelf above the second oven, where the temperature was right, and slid it into its place. Quote 18, he said. He kept his back to her. The pause behind him was long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Across the river, she said. Commercial place. Big floor. 6 ovens. Long shifts. Yes. How long? 7 years? He turned. She was still on the stool. Her left hand was on the younger one's shoulder, very lightly, not waking her, just touching, as if she needed to know the younger one was still there. 25, he said. 26. He nodded once, did not ask what had happened between the across-the-river bakery and his back door. She had said, "And now I'm here," the way people said, "And now it's raining," the way you said a thing that was a fact and could not be talked out of being a fact. And Theo Brand, who had inherited a bakery from a grandfather who used to say that bread did not need to know your reasons, recognized the tone. He moved on to the next batch. He measured flour, he poured, he weighed. The brass weight at his throat swung gently against his chest when he leaned over the scales. He felt her watching him weigh. And he felt her notice when he reached for the heavier counterweight and made the small adjustment for the humidity that his grandfather had taught him on a wet night much like this one. He felt her register it. He felt her decide not to comment. The younger one shifted on the table, mumbled something, did not wake. 20, Theo said quietly. 31. She was silent for a moment longer than she needed to be, as though giving him her name was the third thing she had given him that night, and she was no longer sure how many more she had to give. He said. She said. The way she said it was not friendly and not cold. It was the way someone said a word they wanted to remember the shape of. He did not look at her after that for a long time. He worked. He shaped the rolls. He set the next batch to rest. He brought a clean cloth and laid it over the younger one's shoulders, because the back of the bakery, near the door, ran cold once the wind picked up off the wet street. Rena saw him do it. She did not speak. She did not need to. She moved her own hand from Kavi's shoulder and let Theo's cloth do the work instead. And that small surrender of a small task was, Theo understood without quite being able to put it into words, the first thing she had handed to him willingly all night. The wall clock struck 3. He looked up at it. His grandfather had wound it every Sunday morning for 41 years. Theo had wound it every Sunday morning for 3. The brass pendulum swung. The hour faded. He went back to the dough. Behind him on the stool, Rina's amber eyes closed for half a second, opened again, fixed once more on his working hands. She was not going to sleep. He could feel that. She was going to sit on that stool with one hand near Kavi and one ear toward the back room where her daughter breathed. And she was going to watch him work until the dawn came up over the wet street outside. Because that was what you did when you had run out of other options, and the only thing left between you and the cold was a stranger's bolt on a back door. Theo understood this without turning around. He measured the next pour of water, adjusted for the cold, folded the flour in. Outside, on the empty side street, a delivery cart rolled past, 2 blocks away, and did not stop. Inside the bakery, 4 heartbeats kept their separate times, and somewhere above the second oven, a wooden spoon, forgotten in a small green fist, slipped 1 quiet inch sideways against an armchair arm. The back door bolt held. Dawn came up gray. Theo saw it through the small front window before he heard it. The sky above the wet stone of the side street went from black to the color of old tin, and the single lamppost outside his door, which had flickered all night, gave one last shudder and went out. He pulled the second batch of rolls from the oven, set them on the rack, brushed the tops with butter while they were still hot enough to drink it in. He had been doing this for 3 years, and the motion had never once changed. Behind him, on her stool, Rina had finally stopped pretending she wasn't tired. Her head rested on her folded arm where it lay across Kavi's shoulder, and her amber eyes were closed, though Theo did not believe for a second that she was asleep. The younger one had not moved in over an hour. In the back room, through the half-open door, he could see the corner of the armchair and 1 tiny red shoe with its Velcro strap pointing up at the ceiling. The first knock came at 5:42. Theo recognized the rhythm before he recognized the man. 3 taps, a pause, 2 taps. Old Halston came every morning before his shift at the brickyard, bought 1 dark loaf, paid in coins counted into his palm. The old man had been buying his bread from Theo's grandfather since before Theo was born. Theo crossed to the front, slid the inside bolt, opened the door an inch. The cold air came in. He stepped through into the front of the shop and pulled the door to the kitchen halfway shut behind him. Halston came in, counted his coins, took his loaf, said nothing he hadn't said yesterday, left. Theo stood at the wooden counter for a moment after the bell stopped ringing. Then he went back through, took the next bread out of the oven, and started slicing the cheap day-old for the boys who came in at 6. They came. A pair of stone layers first, then a tired woman in a postal uniform, then 3 apprentices from the Coopers on the next street, who always argued about who owed who 2 coppers. Theo served them. He had served them 6 mornings a week for 3 years. They paid him. They left. The bell rang. The bell rang. The bell rang. The kitchen door behind him stayed where he had set it, half shut, the gap just wide enough to let the heat through, and not wide enough for anyone at the counter to see what was on the other side. Rena had understood without being told. He'd heard her, somewhere around 5, move Kavi gently off the stool and back into the back room. He'd heard the soft creak of the armchair as the younger one curled up beside Meal. He'd heard the back room door click closed, very quietly. He had not turned around. He had not thanked her. He had set out the morning's tray and waited for the first knock. By 7:20, the rush was thinning. He was wiping down the counter when he heard, behind him, a small, barefooted scuff on the floorboards. He turned. Meal was in the kitchen doorway. 2 stubby pigtails, yellow ribbons, a handmade knit dress in soft yellow with little white flowers along the hem. The same dress she had slept in, rumpled now from the armchair. White tights with the hole at the knee. 1 tiny red shoe on her left foot, the other foot bare. Her wooden spoon was in her right hand. Her enormous amber eyes were fixed on the doorway to the front of the shop and on the customer who was standing on the other side of the wooden counter. A man, middle-aged, brown coat. Theo did not know his name. The man came in twice a week, bought 2 seeded rolls and a small, dark loaf, paid in paper, left. Quiet, polite. The kind of customer Theo had begun to think of, over 3 years, as part of the room. The man saw Meal. He had been counting his coins into his palm. His hand stopped. Theo stood at the counter with the cloth in his fingers and felt the morning go still around him in a way that mornings were not supposed to go still. Meal did not run. She did not hide. She held her wooden spoon and looked at the man with the serious eyes of a 4-year-old who had already done all her deciding about strangers before she had finished her first breakfast. She had decided about Theo within 1 second the night before because he was covered in flour, and that meant kitchen, and kitchen meant safe. She had not yet decided about this one. The man's eyes went from Meal to Theo. Theo set the cloth down on the counter, slowly. He did not move from where he was standing. He did not call to the back room. He did not step in front of the child. He simply put down what was in his hand and waited, because he understood, in that long second, that the next thing that happened in his bakery was not going to be decided by him. The man looked at Meal again. She lifted her wooden spoon, just a little, not threatening, just showing him, the way a 4-year-old shows a stranger a treasure, that she had a spoon. The man's mouth moved. Theo thought for a half-second that he was going to say something. He did not. He looked down at the coins in his palm, counted them again, the way men do when they need something to do with their hands. Set the right number on the counter. Picked up his 2 seeded rolls and his small dark loaf, which Theo had already wrapped in the brown paper before he had turned around, and he put them in the crook of his arm. He nodded at Theo. Once. Then, after a moment that felt longer than it was, he nodded at Meal. Meal, very gravely, nodded back. The man turned. The bell rang. The door closed. Theo watched the door close. He kept watching it after it had closed. He watched the way the dust settled on the inside of the glass, the way the wet street outside reflected the new gray of the sky, the way the lamppost, dark now, leaned a little to the left where someone had clipped it with a cart last winter, and no one had ever come to straighten it. Behind him, a soft, hurried step, then a stop. He turned his head a quarter. Rina stood in the kitchen doorway, one hand on the frame, the other halfway out toward her daughter. She had not crossed the threshold. She had come as far as the door, and she had stopped. Because she had seen the back of the brown coat going through the front door, and she had heard, in the half-second between, the bell ring without an alarm in it. She did not speak. She did not move. She did not breathe that Theo could see. For what felt like a longer moment than the customer himself had taken, Mille turned around, saw her mother, walked the 4 small steps back across the kitchen floor on one shoe and one bare foot, dragging the spoon along the boards, and held up both arms to be picked up. Rena picked her up. Her amber eyes met Theo's over the top of the yellow ribbons. They did not say anything. They did not need to. Theo understood in the look that she had heard every footstep of what had just happened from the back room, and that she had stood up at the wrong second, and that she was telling him, without telling him, that she knew she had stood up at the wrong second. He shook his head once, very slightly. It was nothing. She closed her eyes for 1 full second, pressed her cheek against the top of Mille's head. Theo turned back to the counter, picked up the cloth, wiped down a clean surface for the second time in 2 minutes because his hands needed something to do. Outside, the man in the brown coat crossed the street with his bread under his arm and turned the corner toward the river. He did not look back. He did not speak to anyone he passed. He walked at the same pace he always walked. Theo watched him go. He watched until the brown coat was out of sight. He kept watching the empty corner for another long moment after that, because he understood, the way a baker understands a rising dough by the way the cloth moves over the top of it, that something in his small front shop had just been put down on the counter and weighed, and that he would not know for some hours yet whether the weight on the scale was going to come back even. The bell did not ring again for a while. The wall clock in the kitchen behind him struck the half hour. The morning trade ran out by 10. Theo locked the front, turned the small wooden sign on its chain so the painted word faced inward, and stood for a moment with his hand on the latch. The wet street was beginning to dry in patches. A delivery cart clattered past 2 doors down. Inside the shop, the smell of crust was already starting to fade into the smell of yeast from the next batch waiting in the back. He turned the latch, walked through to the kitchen. Rina was at the big table. She had not been asked. She had not been told. She had simply, at some point in the last 20 minutes, set Mille down in the back room with Kavi and a piece of yesterday's heel to chew on, and come out and rolled up the cuffs of the cream cardigan and started cleaning the table. She had a damp cloth in one hand. She was working the dried flour out of the seam where the boards met. Theo had not cleaned that seam in 3 weeks. He knew this because she had cleaned about half of it, and he could see, in the half she had finished, the wood was a different color. He stopped in the doorway. She felt him stop. She did not look up. She just moved the cloth 1 more pass along the seam and then folded it in half and waited. Theo crossed to the cold proofer, lifted the cloth on the slow batch, checked the rise. It was on schedule. He set the cloth back and turned around and leaned his back against the proofer and looked at her over the length of the floured table. He said it plainly. He told her she could have the back room for a few days. He told her he did not know what came after that. He told her he was not going to pretend he had a plan, because if he pretended he had a plan, she would know within an hour that he didn't. And then she would have to also pretend along with him, and he didn't have the energy for that kind of pretending, and he suspected she had even less. She listened to him without lifting her eyes from the cloth in her hand. When he had finished, she said into the table that she could work. She could knead, she could shape, she knew ovens, she had her own hands. She would not eat what she didn't earn. Theo did not answer for a moment. The wall clock ticked. A floorboard in the back room creaked under one small bare foot and went still again. He should have said yes immediately. He knew that. He had known it the moment she'd lifted her thumb to test the give of his crumb the night before. He had known it again when he had watched her right hand twitch on the stool, wanting to mirror the motion of his need. He had known it for the third time half an hour ago, when he had walked back into his kitchen and seen her cleaning a seam in the table that his grandfather had cleaned every morning for 41 years, and that Theo had been meaning to clean for 3 weeks. He still hesitated. His grandfather had worked alone. Every night, for as long as Theo could remember, the old man had stood at this same table by himself, the wall clock ticking above him, the ovens breathing, the brass weight at his throat swinging the same small swing it now made at Theo's. He had taught Theo every recipe in the book on the shelf, and he had taught him by standing next to him, but he had never, not once in 41 years, hired a second pair of hands. Theo had inherited the recipes. He had inherited the ovens. He had inherited, without meaning to, the shape of the silence the old man had built around himself in this kitchen. He hesitated because, for 1 second, he did not know whether he was allowed to break it. Rhina saw the hesitation. Of course she saw it. She had been measuring him for hidden cost since the back door opened 9 hours ago, and she would go on measuring him for hidden cost for some time yet. Her amber eyes lifted from the cloth for the first time, and she looked at him across the table, and her mouth made the small, flat shape of a woman who had spent the night believing something would have a price, and had now learned what the price was. She set the cloth down, folded it once. She said, quietly, that she understood. She said it the way someone said, "The rain has started." Not bitter, not surprised. A fact. She turned to walk back to the back room. Underscore, quote, 36, Theo said. She stopped. He pushed off the proofer, crossed the kitchen to the long shelf where his grandfather's recipe book sat between 2 old tins. He did not touch the book. He touched the shelf next to it, where a second apron hung on a wooden peg. The apron was clean. It had been clean for 3 years. It was the apron his grandfather had worn for the last decade of his life. Dark gray, like Theo's, 2 front pockets, a knot tied at the back in the old man's own knot, which Theo had never had the heart to undo. It had been hanging there the whole time. He lifted it off the peg. He came back across the kitchen and held it out to her. She did not take it immediately. She looked at the apron. She looked at his face. She looked at the apron again, and Theo could see, in the way her amber eyes went still, that she had understood at once that this was not the apron of the back room corner where strangers slept. This was the apron of the shelf next to the recipe book, and she had been in enough bakeries to know what the apron on the shelf next to the recipe book meant. She took it. She did not put it on yet. She held it folded over her left forearm, and she ran the pad of her right thumb across the front pocket where the cloth was a little darker from 40 years of a flour-dusted thumb resting there. She said his name, quietly. Just the one word. He shook his head. Come. He walked to the cold proofer. She followed. He showed her the slow batch. He lifted the cloth. She bent her head over the bowl, and her loose braid fell over her right shoulder, and the gold key at her throat swung once and settled against the wine-red wool. She pressed 2 fingers, very gently, into the surface of the dough, counted the slow rebound under her breath, looked up at him. She gave him a number. It was the same number he would have given. To the minute. Theo nodded once. She let the cloth fall back over the bowl. She straightened. She unfolded the apron over her left arm, slipped the loop over her head, and reached behind her to tie the knot. Her hands were quicker at it than his had been the first time he'd tied his grandfather's knot. She had tied this knot 1,000 times in a bakery on the other side of the river, on long shifts, in a uniform she had not chosen, under an owner who in the end had told her to do what she would not do. She tied it the same way. 2 loops, a pull, a small, flat bow. She smoothed the front of the apron down with both hands. In the doorway of the back room, very quietly, meal had appeared. The yellow ribbons, the wooden spoon, the serious amber eyes. She was watching her mother. She was watching her mother tie an apron in a kitchen that was not the kitchen of 3 days ago. She had a piece of bread crust in her left hand. She lifted it to her mouth. She chewed once, gravely, and did not take her eyes off her mother. Kavi appeared behind her, headphones round her neck, the teal streak of her hair sticking up on one side from sleep. Saw the apron. Saw her cousin's hands, smoothing the front of it. Said nothing. Looked at Theo. Looked at Rina. Looked at the apron again, and the corner of her mouth did the small, quick thing of a 19-year-old who has lived for 2 years on the edge of her cousin's worry and has just felt the edge move 1 inch back. Theo went to the flour bin. He measured out the next pour. The brass weight at his throat swung against the cotton of his shirt. Behind him, the sound of a damp cloth being folded a second time, set down. The sound of a second pair of hands he had not heard in this kitchen in 3 years, reaching for the bench knife where he had left it on the corner of the table. The bench knife came up, met the dough, began the first cut. Theo did not turn around. He poured the water into the well. He watched the surface pool. He folded the flour in from the edges, slowly, the way his grandfather had folded it on a wet night much like this one. Outside the front window, the brown coat from earlier that morning did not pass again. The street stayed empty. The lamp-post stayed leaning. The wall clock above the second oven kept its slow time. In the kitchen, 2 pairs of hands began, for the first time, to work the same dough at opposite ends of the same table. And somewhere on the dry street, 4 doors down and turning toward the corner of the alley, a different man, a baker from 2 streets over, was just then deciding that he would, in the morning, walk down this side street and have a quiet word with Theo Brand. The bench knife came down again on the table. Once, twice, a third time. Neither of them spoke. 12:28. Midnight came back around. The shop had been closed since noon. Theo had slept 4 hours in the narrow bed above the kitchen, the way he always slept, on his side, one arm under the pillow. He had woken without an alarm, the way he always woke, because his body had been keeping the clock for 3 years and did not need help anymore. He pulled on a clean shirt, rolled the cuffs, tied the dark gray apron, came down the back stairs at 11:58, the way he came down every night, with his hand running along the wall in the dark, because he did not need a light to find the steps. There was a light on in the kitchen. He stopped on the bottom stair. Rina was already there. She had the second apron on. She had her loose braid pinned up off her neck with 2 small wooden pins he had not seen her have the day before. She was at the big table. She had set out the scales, the bench knife, the 2 long wooden bowls, and a clean cloth in exactly the order he set them out himself every night without thinking about it. She had done it because she had watched him do it once, 22 hours ago, and she had a baker's memory for the order of a table. He stepped down off the last stair. She did not turn around. She said, into the table, that the slow batch was at temperature, that she had folded it twice while he slept, on the schedule the cloth had told her, that she had not started anything new without him. Theo crossed to the proofer, lifted the cloth. The dough had risen exactly the way it should have risen. He set the cloth back. He nodded once at her shoulder. He went to the long shelf. He did not reach for the flour. He reached for the recipe book. He had not taken it down from the shelf in front of another person since the year his grandfather had died. He had not, in fact, taken it down for himself in nearly that long, because he had carried every recipe in it inside his hands for so many years that the book had become less a working tool and more the shape of a man standing next to him in the kitchen. He lifted it now with both palms, the way the old man had taught him to lift it, brought it across to the table, set it down on the corner where the flour did not reach. Rhina looked at it. She did not move. The book was bound in dark leather that had cracked at the spine and been stitched back together twice, both times by his grandfather, both times with the wrong color thread. The cover had a stain in the lower right corner from a kettle that had also stained the linen cloth above the second oven. The pages, when Theo opened it, were the color of old butter. The ink was brown in the older entries and black in the newer. Every page had a handwritten recipe, and in the margin, in a different and shakier version of the same hand, the small notes the old man had added over 41 years of working those recipes in this kitchen. Theo turned it so it faced her. She came across the table to look. She did not reach for the page. She put her hands behind her back, the way she had done at the door on the first night, and she leaned forward and read. She turned the first page herself only after she had asked him, without speaking, by lifting her amber eyes to his face. He nodded. She turned the page with 2 fingers at the top corner, very carefully, the way she would have turned a page in a recipe book at the bakery across the river, because the bakery across the river had also had a book, he understood now, and the book across the river had also been the heart of someone's kitchen, and she had been taught somewhere by someone how a book like this was to be held. She turned 12 pages. She stopped at the 13th. She looked at it for a long time. Theo waited. He had been on the other side of the table the whole time. He could not see which page she had stopped at. He could see only her face and the small, still way her amber eyes were moving down the lines of his grandfather's handwriting, and the way her left hand had come up, without her noticing, to touch the gold key at her throat. She said it quietly. She knew this one. Different name. Same bread. Theo crossed around the table. She did not move out of his way. He came to stand at her shoulder, and he looked down at the page she was looking at, and the page she was looking at was the dark rye his grandfather had baked every Thursday for 41 years. Heavy crust, caraway, a long, slow rise, twice. A small handful of toasted seed pressed into the top in a pattern the old man had drawn in the margin in a single, careful line. Theo had not baked this one in 14 months. He had not baked it since the 2nd anniversary of his grandfather's death, when he had stood at this same table at 2 in the morning and had laid out the seed and the rye and the long bench knife, and had looked at the empty space on the other side of the table where the old man had used to stand, and had put the seed and the rye and the bench knife back in their places without measuring a single thing. He had not, until this moment, understood that this was why he had not baked it. Rhina did not know any of that. She only said, after a moment, that she had made this bread for 7 years across the river, that her owner had called it by another name, that she had not been allowed to press the seed in the pattern in the margin because the owner had said the pattern slowed the line. She had pressed it anyway, on the loaves she had made for herself, in the dark before the shift started, with no one watching. She lifted her amber eyes to him. She asked him, without quite asking, whether he wanted to make this one tonight. Theo nodded. He went to the rye flour. She went to the seed jar on the upper shelf, which she had located, somehow, between the time he had gone upstairs to sleep and the time he had come back down. She brought the seed jar across, set it next to the book, reached for the toasting pan and put it on the low burner without asking, because she did not need to ask. They worked. They did not speak for a long time. He measured the rye, she measured the water. He cracked the well. She poured. He folded the flour in from the edges. She brought the second cloth. He turned the dough out onto the floured table. She passed him the bench knife. The seed toasted in the pan beside them, and the small, dry sound of it cracking against the iron was the only sound in the kitchen besides the wall clock and the small breath of the two ovens running their preheat. He kneaded. She watched. She watched the way her right hand had watched the first night, on the stool, twitching to mirror him. This time her hands did not have to twitch. This time, when he stepped back from the table after the first knead, she stepped in. She kneaded the second turn. He stepped to the seed pan, drew it off the heat, tipped the seed onto a board to cool. He came back. She stepped out. He took the third turn. They had not agreed on the rhythm. They simply had the rhythm, because both of them had been taught by people who had taught the same rhythm in two different kitchens 40 years apart. And the rhythm was the rhythm, regardless of who had taught it. Through the half-open door of the back room, Kavi sat cross-legged on the floor next to the armchair. She had a small picture book open on her knees. Mil was awake. She was sitting in the armchair with the wooden spoon laid across her lap like a fork at a table. Kavi was reading to her in a low voice, the kind of low voice that an older cousin uses to a small cousin who is tired but not yet ready to sleep. And the sound of it carried through the doorway in pieces, but not in words. Theo, halfway through pressing the seed into the top of the first rye loaf in the old pattern from the margin, heard one piece of Kavi's reading drift through. He did not turn around. Rina did not turn around either. She had her thumb against the side of the dough, finishing the second loaf. But Theo saw, in the small motion at the corner of her mouth, that she had heard her cousin's voice, and that the sound of it in this kitchen, on this side of the river, was a sound she had not been sure she would hear again 3 nights ago. The first rye went into the oven at 1:12. Theo closed the door, set the timer. The brass weight at his throat swung once and settled. He turned around. Rina was at the table, wiping the seed crumbs from the boards with the side of her hand and brushing them carefully into her palm so as not to lose them. She did not throw them away. She tipped them back into the jar. He had been about to say something to her about the bread. He was not sure what. Something about the pattern. Something about the margin. Something about the fact that he had not pressed the pattern in 14 months. None of it was a thing that wanted to be said out loud. He did not say it. He picked up the cloth instead and wiped the corner of the table where she had not reached yet, and the two of them stood at the long table in the yellow light of the kitchen, working in silence, and the night moved on. I want to ask you something, just to you, listening to this in the small hours, or on a walk, or in a car somewhere. Have you ever had a person come into your life at the wrong time of night, with too little to offer? And have you ever, without quite meaning to, taken down off the top shelf the book you had not opened in a year and put it on the table between you? If the answer is yes, Or if the answer is, not yet, but I would like to be the kind of person who could, leave the like for Theo and Rena, and stay with me for the rest of this story. The next part is the one where someone comes from outside this room to tell Theo that the door he opened the other night is the wrong door to leave open. And I want you in the kitchen with us when he does. In the back room, Kavi's voice had gone quieter. Meal's amber eyes were closing in the armchair. The wooden spoon slipped one slow inch across her knee and stopped. Theo set the timer for the second loaf. Outside, somewhere on the dry side street, a single set of footsteps passed the front of the shop, slowed for a heartbeat, and went on. Rena's head came up. Theo, with his hand still on the timer, met her amber eyes across the table and saw that she had heard the slowing too. Neither of them spoke. The footsteps faded toward the corner. The footsteps did not come back that night. They came back the next afternoon at 3:15, when the shop was quiet and Theo was alone at the front counter, sorting the day's coppers into the brass tin his grandfather had used for the same job. Rena was in the back room with Meal. Kavi had gone 2 streets down to buy a packet of the cheap dye she put in her hair, because she had announced over breakfast that the teal was fading and that she refused to look, in her own words, like a tired river. The bell rang. Theo looked up. Old Pell stood in the doorway, baker from 2 streets over, wide shoulders, gray at the temples, flour on the cuffs of his coat from the morning shift he had already done. He had bought a loaf of Theo's grandfather's rye every Sunday for 20 years. Theo had known him his whole life. The man stepped in, closed the door behind him with the care of someone who did not want the bell to ring twice, and stood at the counter with his hat in his hands. He did not buy anything. He said, after a moment, that he had heard. He did not say what he had heard. He did not need to. He said it the way the men of their trade said things to each other, with the words shaved down to the bone, and Theo, who had been sorting coppers into the brass tin, set the last copper down and did not pick up another. Pell said his name, Theo, quietly, the way an older man said a name when he had carried the boy who owned the name on his shoulder 40 years ago at a midsummer fair. He said he was not here to make trouble. He said it twice. He said people were talking, not in a loud way, in the quiet way, which was worse. He said the wife of the man in the brown coat had said something to her sister, and the sister had said something to her husband, and the husband ran the cart that brought the morning eggs to half the cafes on this side of the river, and the cart driver had a mouth that worked all day in every kitchen he stopped at. Theo listened. He kept his hands flat on the counter on either side of the brass tin. Pell said the words, "Be careful, Theo." He said them once. He did not say them like a threat. He said them like a man laying down a clean cloth over something that had begun to spoil, because he did not know what else to do with the spoil. Theo lifted his eyes. He looked at Pell for a long moment. He said, evenly, "Let them talk." Pell's jaw worked once. He had not come for that answer. He had come to deliver a kindness in the shape of a warning, and the kindness had been received, and the warning had been set aside, and the 2 men who had known each other for 31 years stood on opposite sides of a wooden counter and understood, without saying so, that something in the shape of the room between them had quietly changed. Pell put his hat back on. Said Theo's grandfather had been a stubborn man, too. Said he meant it as a fact, not a compliment, and not the opposite of one. Touched the brim of the hat once. Left. The bell rang. The door shut. Theo stood with both hands on the counter until the bell had gone fully still. Then he heard behind him the soft sound of a cardigan brushing the door frame. He turned his head a quarter. Rhina was in the kitchen doorway. She had meal on her hip. The child was half asleep against her shoulder, the wooden spoon trailing down her mother's back, the yellow ribbons crooked. Rhina's amber eyes were on Theo. She had heard the conversation. He could see in her face that she had heard all of it. She had not stepped forward. She had not let meal come through into the front. She had stood in the doorway and listened, because she had been the subject of the conversation, and she had a right to hear it. She said, into the quiet of the closed shop, that she could leave. She did not say it as an offer. She said it as a clean fact, set down between them on the counter the way Pell had set down his warning. She said it without lifting her voice, without any softness in the corners, because she had spent a night and 2 days measuring this man for hidden cost, and she was, at this moment, offering him the easy exit she had not yet been entirely sure he would not eventually ask for. Theo did not answer right away. He looked at her across the small front shop. He looked at the child on her hip. He looked at the brass measuring weight against his shirt and at the brass 10 on the counter, and he thought, briefly and without dramatizing it, that there were 2 kinds of inheritance in this life. The kind you were given by an old man who had stood in a kitchen alone for 41 years, and the kind you chose by what you did with the kitchen after he was gone. He said it quietly. He said it was not a problem. He said it was just talk. Rena held his look for a long second. She did not say thank you. She did not say anything. She shifted meal a little higher on her hip, the way mothers shift sleeping children when the arm under them has begun to ache, and she turned, and she walked back into the kitchen. Theo watched the empty doorway after her. Then he went back to the coppers. He counted them into the brass tin. He counted them twice, because the first count had not quite stuck in his head. The bell on the door did not ring again for the rest of the afternoon. Outside, on the dry side street, a thin wind had come up from the river. It pushed a single brown leaf along the wet gutter and lodged it against the leaning lamp-post and would not let it go. In the kitchen, Rena set meal down on the worn armchair, covered her with the cream cardigan from her own shoulders, and stood looking down at the child for a long minute without moving. Then she went to the long shelf where Theo's grandfather's recipe book sat between the 2 old tins, and she did not open the book, but she rested 2 fingers very lightly on the cracked leather of the cover, and she left them there until the wall clock above the second oven struck the quarter. The brass tin clicked shut at the counter in the front. The afternoon ran on toward dusk. 12:31. The slow afternoon came 2 days later. It was a Wednesday. Wednesdays were always thin. The shop had emptied by 2. The last of the lunch rolls had gone with a courier who paid in a single folded note, and Theo had pulled the bell side bolt halfway across the door so the bell would not ring at full pitch if anyone came in. He had a batch of small twists shaping on the table, slow work, the kind of work he did with his hands while his head went somewhere quieter. Rena was in the back room. He could hear her voice, low, reading the same picture book Kavi had read on the first night, in the same low, cousinly tone, only with the small adjustments a mother made for a 4-year-old who knew the pictures by heart and would correct you if you skipped a page. Kavi was at the front counter on a stool. She had finished re-dyeing the streak in her hair that morning and had announced, with the wide, tuskish grin she gave for any small triumph,
that she had decided to learn how to wrap a loaf in brown paper without using more string than the loaf weighed. She had wrapped 6 so far. 3 of them looked like loaves. The other 3 looked like accidents. Meal wandered out of the back room. She came on her own.
One red shoe, one bare foot, the wooden spoon in her right hand, the hem of the yellow dress dragging a little because she had not noticed she'd untucked the small apron Rhina had double-tied around her waist that morning. She walked the length of the kitchen with the gravity of a small queen on an inspection, and she stopped at the corner of the big table at Theo's elbow, and she stood there. Theo, shaping the next twist, glanced down. She lifted her wooden spoon. Then she lifted her free hand. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She turned her palm up to him in the universal gesture of a 4-year-old asking for a piece of what the grown-up was holding. And Theo, without looking at her again, broke a small piece off the dough on the table, no bigger than the inside of his thumb, and set it on the wood next to her. He went on with his twist. Meal set the spoon down. With both small green hands, she picked up the dough. She did not eat it. She put it back on the table, flat, in front of her own knees. She began to knead. Theo did not look down at her again for a long time. He could hear her, though. The serious, small breathing through her nose, the patting of the dough with both palms, the way she had seen her mother do it from the kitchen doorway over the last 2 evenings. He could hear her wooden spoon roll a quarter turn on the table when she nudged it out of her own way with an elbow. He could hear, once, the tiny tip of her tongue come out and stick to the inside of her lower lip from the effort of working a piece of dough that was already, to be honest, slightly overworked for its size. He kept shaping. He did not slow down. He did not speed up. He picked up the next length of dough, gave it the long pull and the small twist, set it on the floured tray, and reached for the next. Through the doorway of the back room, on its other side, Rhina stopped reading. Theo did not turn around. He felt her stop. He heard, very quietly, the soft sound of her standing up from where she had been sitting on the edge of the armchair. He heard the small creak of one floorboard near the doorway as she came as far as the frame. She did not cross it. She stood in the doorway with her hands on the wood on either side, and she watched her daughter knead a piece of dough no bigger than a walnut, beside a man no relation to either of them, in a kitchen that 28 hours ago she had offered to walk out of. Theo, without raising his eyes, picked up a tiny scrap of dough off the end of his own twist and set it on Meal's piece, the way a man added a topping to a loaf. He pressed it down with the tip of one finger. Meal watched. She copied him. She added a topping to her topping, then a topping to that. By the time she had finished, her piece of dough looked like a small green hand had built a flower-colored staircase on the table, and she sat back on her heels with the gravity of an architect and considered her work. Theo glanced down at last. He said, evenly, that it was a fine loaf and that he would bake it next. Meal did not smile. Smiling was for other situations. She nodded once, very seriously, the way her mother had nodded the first night at the back door. And she picked up the wooden spoon and held it out flat across her 2 palms toward Theo. He understood. He took the spoon. He laid it carefully on the floured table beside his shaping board. He turned to the small tray of seeds at his elbow. He took 2 grains of caraway. He set them on the top of her staircase loaf, one slightly off-center, the way the margin in his grandfather's book said to set them on the bigger version of the same idea. He gave the wooden spoon back. Meal took it gravely.
She put it under her arm like a tool she had finished using and was now responsible for. Theo lifted the small staircase loaf onto the corner of the next tray going into the oven. He slid the tray in, closed the door.
Set the timer for half the normal time, because the loaf was the size of a coin. Rena, in the doorway, had not moved. She watched her daughter watch the oven door. She watched Theo, beside the oven, set the brass weight back against his shirt, where it had swung forward when he bent. She watched him pick up his cloth, wipe the small dusting of flour off the corner of the table where Meal had worked, and leave the wooden spoon exactly where Meal had set it down, because the wooden spoon was a tool now, and tools belonged on the table. She did not cross the doorway. She lifted her right hand and pressed 2 fingers very briefly to her own mouth, lowered it, turned, went back into the back room. Theo heard her sit down again on the edge of the armchair. He heard her, after a moment, pick the picture book back up. Her voice resumed at the page she had stopped on, only the voice was a little lower now, a little slower, the way a mother reads when she is not quite reading to the child anymore, but to herself, on a page she has already read 50 times, because the page is doing something for her that has nothing to do with the words. At the front counter, Kavi looked up from her 7th attempt at wrapping a loaf. She had heard the silence at the doorway. She had heard also the small click of the oven door. She looked at Theo. She looked at Meal. She looked at the wooden spoon on the table. She did not say anything either, because she had been Rina's cousin for 19 years, and she had learned somewhere along the way that there were small rooms in her cousin's chest that did not open in front of speaking. She bent her head back to her loaf. The timer ran. When it rang, Theo opened the oven and took out the small staircase loaf with the long peel, and the loaf had come out lopsided and a little burnt on one side because he had set it too close to the back wall on purpose, because he wanted it to look as though it had been baked by somebody real. He set it on a clean square of brown paper. He let it cool a full minute, the proper minute, no shortcut. Then he picked it up and walked it the 4 steps across the kitchen to where Meal was waiting and held it out to her on the brown paper square. Meal took it with both hands. She did not hold it against her chest. She held it out in front of her, flat on the paper, the way a 4-year-old holds a thing too important to risk. The 2 grains of caraway had baked into a small, dark pear on the top of the loaf, slightly off-center, exactly the way the margin had said. She turned around. She walked the 4 steps back to the doorway of the back room. She held the loaf out, on its paper, to her mother. Rina had stood up again at some point. She was waiting at the doorway. She bent down. She did not take the loaf from her daughter's hands. She put her own hands underneath the brown paper, supporting it, and let Meal keep her grip on the top, and she lifted both her daughter's hands and her own and the loaf together, the way 2 people who have built a thing together carry it through a doorway, and she said something in a low voice in her own language, 3 short words that Theo did not understand. Meal nodded. They went into the back room with the loaf together. Theo turned back to the table. The 7th of Kavi's accidents was just being placed on the counter at the front. The wooden spoon lay where Meal had set it. The wall clock ticked the half-hour. The small dusting of flour where a child's piece of dough had been was already gone, swept by his own cloth, and only a darker square on the wood remained, the size of the inside of a thumb, where the table had been cleaned of 3 weeks of forgetting. The bell on the door, behind the half-drawn bolt, did not ring. Outside on the side street, somewhere 2 blocks down, a cart driver was finishing his afternoon round and stopping in at a flour merchant's office. and the cart driver was saying a name, and the flour merchant was setting down his pen and listening, and the listening was going to cost a small bakery, by the end of the week, the only supplier it had used for 41 years. Theo did not yet know any of that. He picked up the next length of dough, gave it the long pull and the small twist. The wall clock ticked on. The summons came in writing. It arrived on Friday morning, slid under the front door by a delivery boy who did not ring the bell. Theo found it on the floorboards when he turned the sign at 6. A single folded sheet, the flour merchant's red wax stamp on the seam, 2 lines inside in the merchant's own shorthand, asking Theo to come to the office on the riverside that morning at 10 regarding the standing account. Theo read it twice, folded it back along its crease, slid it into the front pocket of his apron. He worked the morning rush as usual. He served Halston his loaf. He served the postal woman. He served the apprentices from the Coopers who argued again about their 2 coppers and again did not resolve it. He did not tell Rina about the letter. He did not tell Kavi. He finished the rush. He locked the front at 9:20. He went upstairs, took off the apron, hung it on the peg in his room, washed the flour from his forearms with the cold tap, and put on the dark wool coat he wore on the rare occasions he had to leave the side street. He came back down in the coat. Rina was at the big table, scoring the tops of the second batch with the small, curved blade his grandfather had used for the same job. She glanced up, saw the coat, set the blade down very carefully on the edge of the table, blade side in, the way a baker who respects sharp things sets a sharp thing down. He told her he would be back by 11. She did not ask where. She only looked at the coat 1 second longer than she needed to, and then she nodded and picked the blade back up. He went. The merchant's office was a long walk in the cold, 12 minutes if you cut through the small market square. Theo cut through it. The market was thin on a Friday morning. A woman selling late apples nodded at him. He nodded back. He did not stop. The brass weight at his throat sat under the wool of the coat where no one could see it, and he was aware of the small, forgotten pressure of it against his chest the whole way. The office was above a grain store. He climbed the wooden stairs. He had climbed these stairs perhaps 50 times in 3 years, and perhaps 300 times in his life. The door at the top had a small brass plate that said the merchant's name. He knocked. He went in. The merchant was at his desk, a man of 60-something. Wide, heavy hands. He had bought flour from the same 3 mills for 40 years, and he had sold it to Theo's grandfather for 38 of those years, and to Theo for 3. He was not unkind. He was not the man in the brown coat. He was something simpler than either of those, which was a tradesman who had a wife and 3 grown children, and a daughter-in-law who had a sister whose husband drove a cart, and the cart driver, on Wednesday afternoon, had said a name. He did not stand up when Theo came in. He pointed at the chair across the desk. Theo sat. The merchant did not waste it. He said it the way men of his trade said everything, with the words shaved down to the bone. He said he had heard. He said he was not here to argue with what Theo did in his own kitchen. He said he was here to say that if the 2 of them stayed past the end of the week, he would stop selling. He did not look at Theo while he said it. He looked at the inkstand. Theo did not answer for a moment. He looked at the man on the other side of the desk. He looked at the inkstand the man was looking at. He looked at the small clock on the wall, which was a cheaper clock than the one in his own kitchen, and did not tick as evenly, and he thought, briefly, that you could tell a great deal about a room by which clock was in it. He said, evenly, that he understood. He said it the way Rhina had said, "I understand," on the second night, when she had thought she was being told to leave. The merchant's eyes came up at the tone. He had been ready for an argument. He had not been ready for the absence of one. His heavy hand on the desk flattened once and then closed. Theo asked for the invoice for what he already owed. The merchant looked at him for a long second. Then he got up. He went to the ledger on the side cabinet. He turned the pages. He wrote out the figure on a clean slip in his short pencil hand. He brought the slip back to the desk and set it in front of Theo. He sat back down. He did not say anything else. Theo read the figure. It was not small. It was not the worst he had ever seen, either. It was, in fact, almost exactly what he had been carrying in his head as the running total, because he had been a baker's grandson before he had been a baker, and you did not grow up in a flour kitchen without learning to keep the number in your head. He took the leather wallet from the inside of his coat. He counted out the sum on the desk. He counted it slowly. He counted it twice. Bills first, then the coin to settle the odd part. He set the last coin on the top of the small stack. He pushed the stack across the wood toward the merchant. The merchant did not pick it up. He looked at the money. He looked at Theo. He looked at the money again. He said, after a moment, that he had been selling to Theo's grandfather for 38 years. Theo said, evenly, that he knew. Neither of them spoke for what felt like a long time. Then the merchant nodded once. He pulled the stack across the desk with the side of his heavy hand. He took the small receipt book from his drawer. He wrote the receipt in the same short pencil. He tore it off along the perforation. He laid it on the desk between them. Theo picked it up, folded it, put it in the inside pocket of the coat next to the merchant's first letter. He stood up. He thanked the man for the years. He said it without any feeling in it, because the feeling would have insulted both of them. The merchant nodded once, did not stand, did not say anything back. Theo walked to the door, opened it, closed it behind him, and went down the wooden stairs into the cold. He walked back through the market the same way he had come. The apple woman was still there. He stopped this time. He bought 3 apples. He paid with a coin from the wallet that was now lighter than it had been an hour ago. He put the apples in the pocket of the coat where the cloth pulled a little out of shape against the weight of them. He walked the rest of the way back to the side street with his free hand in the other pocket and the brass weight at his chest sitting against the shirt under the coat. The bell rang once when he came in the front. Rhina was at the big table. Kavi was at the front counter. Meal was on the floor under the table with the wooden spoon and a piece of yesterday's heel, having a quiet and very serious conversation with the spoon. Theo crossed the front, took off the coat, hung it on its peg. Came to the table, took the 3 apples out of the coat pocket on the way, and set them in the wooden bowl by the back door. He told Rhina, evenly, that he would be finding a new supplier. She did not move for a second. Then she set the curved blade down on the edge of the table, blade side in, very carefully, the way she had set it down 90 minutes earlier. She looked at him. She had understood the moment he had said new supplier, because she had stood at the table of a bakery on the other side of the river for 7 years, and she knew, the way Theo knew, the way any baker in any kitchen anywhere knew, that for a bakery the flour merchant was everything. He was the morning. He was the price of every loaf. He was the relationship a kitchen lived inside, and you did not simply find another one the way you found another apron. She did not say any of that. She only said, into the quiet of the kitchen, that she could go to her old contacts, that she might know a name. Theo nodded once. He reached for the cloth on the corner of the table.
He wiped a small dusting of flour from the wood that did not really need wiping. He picked the curved blade back up and continued the scoring of the second batch where she had left off, and Rena, after one more long look at him across the table, picked up her cardigan from the back of the stool, slid her arms into it, and went to the back room to get her coat for the walk. Outside, on the dry side street, the wind from the river had not let up. Under the big table, in a small green hand, the wooden spoon turned a quiet circle against the floorboards. She left at noon. She took her coat from the peg in the back room, a long, dark wool, older than her wrap dress, the cuffs worn shiny, and pulled it on over the cream cardigan. She did not braid her hair again. She tucked the loose braid down inside the collar of the coat. She knelt at the armchair, said 2 short sentences in her own language to Emil, who answered with 1 short word and a small, serious nod. And then she stood up and went out by the back door. She did not use the front. Theo did not comment on which door she used. He understood why. Kavi stayed with Emil. She did not ask where her cousin was going. She had seen the coat. She knew enough. Theo worked. He shaped the lunchtime small rolls he had committed to delivering to the courier who came at 1. He made the delivery on time. He served the 2 regular afternoon customers who came in at 2:30. He locked the front at 3, and did not turn the sign back. He stood at the big table afterwards and stared for a long moment at the half-empty flour bin against the back wall. There was enough in it for 2 more nights. After that, there was the small store in the cellar, which would carry him 3 days more if he stretched it. After that, there was nothing. He did not let himself think about the after that. He cleaned. He cleaned the seam in the wood where Rena had cleaned it the first day, and the corresponding seam on the opposite long side, which he had not cleaned in considerably longer. He cleaned the inside of the scales pan. He wiped down the hooks where the peels and the rolling pins hung. He took the curved blade and ran the small stone along its edge twice, the way his grandfather had taught him, and put it back in its drawer. Kavi came out of the back room at 4 with Emil on her hip. Emil had fallen asleep against her shoulder. Kavi laid her on the worn stool by the big table, folded her own jacket under the child's head as a pillow, and crossed quietly to the front counter to keep her usual stool warm. She did not put her headphones on. She kept one ear toward the back door. The light outside changed. The gray of the afternoon went to the deeper gray of the early autumn evening. The lamppost at the corner of the side street came on. The wind that had been pushing the brown leaf along the gutter for 2 days had finally let it go, and Theo, glancing through the small front window, could not see the leaf anywhere. Rena came back at 5:30. The bell did not ring. She came in by the back. Theo heard the bolt slide. He heard her step inside, the soft brush of the coat against the doorframe, the small breath she let out when the warm air of the kitchen met her face. He did not turn around immediately. He gave her the half-second of being inside the door without being looked at, because he had stood at enough doorways himself to know the value of that half-second. She crossed to the big table. She undid the top button of the coat. She did not take it off. She reached into the inside pocket and took out a small, folded square of paper, the kind a clerk in a small office writes a name on, and she set it on the table between them. Theo wiped his hands on the apron, came to the table, picked up the square, unfolded it. A name. A small mill outside the city, West Road. 2 hours by cart. A woman's name beneath the mill's name, with a single word in brackets. Owner. In Rena's own careful pencil. Below that,
In the same hand, two figures, the price per sack and the minimum order. Theo read it again, looked up at her. She said, in the quiet of the kitchen, that the woman did not care who you employed, that the woman ran the mill herself, that her flour was good, that she had once, 4 years ago, sold a small order to the bakery on the other side of the river when their usual line had failed, and Rena had been the one who had received the delivery, and the woman had stayed for tea in the kitchen for half an hour, and had not made a single remark about Rena's hands, or her face, or the small tusk on her lip. She said the price was higher. She said it as a fact, not as an apology. Theo looked at the figure again. It was higher. It was higher in a way that mattered. It was the kind of higher that would, over the course of a quarter, turn a small bakery's small profit into a small loss, and that, over the course of a year, would turn a small loss into a question Theo would have to answer in front of the ledger his grandfather had kept in the same drawer for 41 years. He set the paper down on the table. He looked at Rena across it. She had not taken the coat off. She had not sat down. She was standing on the other side of the flowered wood, the way she had stood there on the first night, hands behind her back, watching him measure something for hidden cost. Only now, this time, the thing being measured was not her. The thing being measured was a number, and he was the one doing the measuring, and she was waiting, in the way of a person who has already done all of her own waiting in 3 days, to see what the man on the other side of the table did with it. Theo did the math in his head. He did it twice, because the first time he had not believed the answer. He thought, briefly, about what his grandfather would have said. The old man had a phrase he had used about money, which was that money was the second loaf, never the first. Theo had not entirely understood the phrase when he was 15. He understood it better now. He looked up. He said, evenly, that they could do this. He used the word we. He did not notice that he had used it until he saw, in her amber eyes, the small, still moment of her noticing. Her face did not change. She did not lift an eyebrow. She did not soften the corner of her mouth. She simply registered the word, set it down somewhere inside herself in the same careful way she had set down the curved blade on the edge of the table that morning, and did not comment. She nodded once. She said, after a moment, that she could place the order tomorrow. That the woman delivered on the 3rd day. That she would handle the correspondence herself because she had the contact and the woman would remember her. Theo nodded. Rena undid the 2nd button of her coat, then the 3rd. She took it off. She hung it on the peg by the back door, the peg next to the 2nd apron, which she had hung back up that morning because she had not wanted to walk through the city in it. She took the apron down, put it on, tied the small flat bow at the back, 2 loops, a pull. She came to the table. She picked up the curved blade Theo had sharpened that afternoon. She tested the edge against the pad of her thumb. She nodded once at the sharpening, the way one craftsman nods at another's work, and she pulled the next tray of loaves toward her to start scoring. On the stool by the table, meal did not wake. The wooden spoon rested on her stomach. Her 2 stubby pigtails had come further loose from their yellow ribbons. Kavi had crossed back from the front counter at some point during Rena's coming in, and was now sitting on the floor next to the stool, with her back against its legs, eyes half closed, listening. Theo went to the ledger drawer. He took out the ledger. He laid it flat on the corner of the table, opened to the current page. He took the pencil from the slot inside the front cover. He wrote, in a single line under the day's date, the new mill's name and the figure per sack from the folded square of paper. He underlined the figure once.
He closed the ledger.
He put it back in the drawer. He picked up the bench knife. He took his place at the table opposite Rena. They began the night's first batch. The wall clock ticked. The wind on the side street outside had picked up again. Inside the kitchen, in the warm yellow light, the brass weight at Theo's throat swung once against his shirt and settled. And on the other side of the flowered wood, a thin gold chain swung once against a thin collarbone and settled in the same rhythm. And the two of them did not look at each other while it did. 3 days, Rena had said. The third day would be Monday. Neither of them said the word Monday. Outside, the lamppost at the corner held its small, steady light against the dark. 12:36. The new flour came on Monday. The cart pulled into the side street at 9:30 in the morning. A small, open cart, 2 horses, the woman from the mill driving herself. She was older than Theo had pictured. Gray hair under a brown headscarf, leather gloves, the kind of forearms that came from 40 years of lifting sacks. She did not come in. She let the back gate of the cart down, helped Theo and Rena carry the 4 sacks in through the back door, one at a time, took the second half of the payment in coin from Theo's hand, counted it without looking down, and tipped the brim of an imaginary hat at Rena on the way back to the driver's seat. She said she would come again in 12 days. She drove away. Theo stood at the back door for a moment after the cart turned the corner. Then it came back in. He shut the door. He slid the bolt. The 4 sacks sat against the back wall where they had set them down. The cloth on each one bore the small stamp of the mill, a different stamp from the one he had seen on every sack in his kitchen for 3 years. The cloth was a slightly coarser weave. The smell of the flour, when he loosened the top tie of the first sack and bent close, was a half-shade darker than what he was used to, a little earthier, a little less polished. Rena had loosened the tie of the second sack alongside him. She put her hand inside, brought up a small handful, let it run between her fingers back into the sack. She tested the grain against her thumb. She did not say anything. Theo did not say anything either. They both knew, without speaking, that the bread that came out of these sacks was not going to be exactly the bread that had come out of the last 3 years of sacks. The hands knew. The noses knew. The grandfather in the wall clock would have known. They started the first batch at midnight. He measured by the brass weight. She poured by the cloth on the bowl. They folded the new flour in from the edges the way they had folded the old flour, with the same motion and the same rhythm, only the dough under their hands behaved one shade differently. It took the water a little slower. It pulled back a little firmer under the heel of the palm. It wanted, Theo realized on the second knead, a slightly longer first rise. He gave it a slightly longer first rise. The first loaves came out at 5:40. He stood at the cooling rack and looked at them. 6 dark crusts, a denser crumb than he had ever produced in this kitchen. The smell was rounder. The color, when he split the heel of the first loaf with the bench knife and showed Rena the inside, was a shade closer to the color of wet sand than it had been a week ago. She tasted it. She chewed slowly. She did not nod, and she did not shake her head. She handed the second piece back to him, and he tasted it too. And what he tasted was a bread that was not quite his grandfather's bread, but was, without question, a bread. The first customer came at 6:42. Old Halston. 3 taps, a pause, 2 taps. He came in with his coins counted in his palm. He set them on the counter. He took his loaf.
Theo wrapped it in the brown paper, slid it across. Halston paused for half a second at the smell. He did not say anything. He carried his loaf out into the cold. The bell rang. By 8, the rush had brought in the rest of the morning regulars, and the new bread had been on the counter in front of every one of them. Some of them noticed the change. Some did not. The postal woman noticed and said so. She said, "Darker," without any feeling in it either way, and paid and left. The apprentices from the Coopers did not notice and argued about their 2 coppers as usual.
A young carpenter Theo did not know well, who had begun coming in a month ago, took the heel slice Theo offered as a test, chewed, said quietly, "I like this better," and bought a second loaf to take home to his wife. A woman who had bought from Theo for 2 years said, in the way that meant she would have to think about it, and bought half her usual. By 10, the new bread was sold out. Theo turned the sign, locked the front, came back through to the kitchen, took the chalkboard down from the nail above the inside of the counter where it had hung blank for 3 years because his grandfather had never used it and Theo had never thought of a reason to start. He carried it to the big table. He set it down. He took a piece of chalk from the small tin on the shelf. He wrote, in his own careful hand, a single short line on the chalkboard. New flour, same kitchen, different crumb. He sat back. He looked at the line. Rhina came across, read it. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she picked up the piece of chalk from where he had set it down. She turned the chalkboard a quarter toward herself. Below his line, on the lower half of the board, in her own careful and slightly different hand, she wrote a second line. It was not in his language. It was 3 short words in her own. The letters were rounder than his. The middle word had a small mark above it that he had not seen written before. She set the chalk back down on the table. She did not push the board back across. She waited. Theo asked her what it meant. She told him. It meant, she said, bread made by hands that needed to make it. She said it without any softness in the corners, the way she said most things. She said it as a fact she was setting down between them on the wood. And Theo, looking down at the board with the 2 lines on it, one in his hand and one in hers, understood that the line she had written was older than this kitchen, older than his grandfather, older than the wall clock and the brass weight and the recipe book on the long shelf, and that she had been carrying it around in her mouth for some time and had not been sure, until that morning, whether she would write it down anywhere. He nodded. He took the chalkboard. He carried it to the front. He hung it back on the nail above the counter where it had hung blank for 3 years. He did not erase her line. He did not erase his own either. He came back through into the kitchen. The wall clock above the second oven struck 11. He took off the apron, hung it on the peg, went upstairs to sleep through the day, the way he had slept through 3 years of days. Only this time he did not lie on his side with his arm under the pillow and stare at the ceiling for half an hour first. He fell asleep almost at once. I want to ask you one last thing before I close this story. The first night, when Theo opened that back door, he had no plan. He did not know any of their names. He stepped back and he said, "Come in," and a small green child slept on his armchair, and a woman he did not know watched his hands at the table until dawn. 3 weeks later, there is a chalkboard above his counter with 2 lines on it, one in his language and one in hers, and he has paid for it with the loss of his oldest supplier and the quiet talk of half a street. If you are still here with me at the end of this, I think you already know the answer to the only question that ever mattered, which is whether the door was worth opening. Stay subscribed. Tell me, in a comment under this story, the name of the person whose door, once,
was opened for you when you had run out of other options. Names matter. Doors matter. Whoever they were, they are part of you now. The story closes on a Tuesday night at 4 in the morning, 3 weeks and 1 day from the night the back door first opened. The bakery is between batches. The sky outside the small front window is just beginning to gray, the way the sky grays in late autumn when the dawn is still an hour off and has begun to think about coming. The wall clock above the second oven ticks. The brass pendulum swings. At the oven, Theo stands with the long peel in one hand, watching the color of the crust through the small glass door, the brass weight at his throat sitting quiet against his shirt. At the big table, Rina is at her end. The wine-red wrap dress has been put away for a softer one in dark green.
The cream cardigan is over the back of the stool. The gold key at her throat catches the yellow light. Her hands are deep in the next dough. Her loose braid has slipped over her right shoulder again. She has not bothered to push it back. In the worn armchair through the half-open door of the back room, Meal sleeps. The wooden spoon is in her right hand. The yellow ribbons are crooked. The miniature apron is tied twice around her waist, the way her mother ties it every morning, the way she will go on tying it for a long time yet. At the front counter, Kavi sits on her stool, headphones around her neck. She yawns once, the wide, tuskish yawn of 19 years old at 4 in the morning, and rests her chin on her folded arms across the wood. The chalkboard above her, on its nail, holds its 2 lines in the yellow light. The line in his hand, the line in hers. Outside the small front window, the side street is empty. The lamppost at the corner holds its small, steady light. The brown leaf, somewhere, has gone where leaves go in the wind off the river. The wet stone has dried. The cold has settled in for the season. Inside, in the warm yellow light, 4 people work and rest in their own quiet places in the same small room. And the wall clock his grandfather wound every Sunday morning for 41 years ticks on toward 5, and the next batch begins to rise. Bread.